Hello, this is a video lecture for our SSC 120 students, The Struggle for Democracy, Chapter 7, Interest Groups and Business Power. So we have our study guide questions, which I will mention a bit during this lecture, and we will go over them at a class time. And I'm just looking at the schedule here. I believe that is October 2nd. We're going to go over these questions. We also have an essay on the three distinct advantages of business, professional, and wealthy have, and I will mention those during the lecture again in the October class. We'll go over that. So I want to start with, here's an example of low amounts of regulation, and this is the Deepwater Horizon disaster in 2016 led to a movie in 2017 in the Gulf of Mexico. It is in fact the largest disaster, natural disaster in American history in the sense of the amount of damage that it done, and it leads to the fact of business having quite an advantage in our society. Lacks government. People screamed about it. So first we're going to look at the two arguments, one of the evils of interest groups, factions as they're called, and then the advantages of them. So question number 23 in Federalist number 10, Madison argues that checks and balances were to prevent what body from gaining influence, and that body is factions. Basically, interest groups would be the way to look at it. And they were considered dangerous because they were self-interested. They have no regard for the general public. And probably a good example is when finances collapsed in 2008. And in the auto industry and the banking industry, we used a bill called TARP to help bail them out. So a lot of anti-interest group feeling. At the same time, America is a leading democracy on the planet because interest groups proliferate our society well beyond business. Elections don't provide specific enough help. It's very easy to join. Some people are members of an interest group and don't even know. The power is dispersed in our society across three governmental levels, state, local, and national. So it's easy to access, and it actually improves democracy. So this is part of why we say having interest groups is a great thing in our democracy. This is a cartoon from the 1900s about the Senate being captured by steel, by copper, by oil, by coal. Those were all natural resources, and those companies had created very large monopolies and kind of controlled the political process. Now, they're not the same companies today, but notice the oil industry was in there, BP, and that Horizon disaster. So this is from number 28. How does pluralism enhance democracy? Well, pluralism enhances democracy by ensuring that no single interest group becomes dominant, because citizens can be part of a variety of interest groups. Citizens can vote for public officials. Both of them try to influence policy. So there's a lot of ways for citizens in different groups to influence policy, and that's what helps keep us democratic. Under the universe of interest groups, we'll look at private interest groups and public interest groups. Now, private interest groups dominate the landscape, business being probably the largest group, but also professionals, and that would be lawyers and technical engineers, lots of people. And then labor, spelled in the English way here, unions, and they have very kind of powerful private interests. And the example here for question 21, what is the most concerning issue for labor unions? Most concerning issue for labor unions is the right to work laws that Wisconsin passed and Ohio tried to pass and failed. So that's the most concerning issue for labor unions. These are typically economically oriented, not ideologically, and particularly for labor, their membership has declined in the last few years. So here's some pictures of some diverse groups, business, and then you see the professionals, doctor, dentist, accountants, lawyers, and then labor unions, of which NSCC has a couple of labor unions that we work with. And here's some public interest, ideological, they're more ideological, things like the environment, civil rights, anti-tax, pro-life, they're on both sides of the liberal and conservative aisle. Nonprofits like medical and charitable, and then government entities, so state and local governments, lobby the national government. So here's Tina Fey. I think this is a good example. She's on strike for the Writers Guild of America, and because several of the um, famous actors went on strike, it helped gain credibility for writers to have their work credited when it got on the internet. So it's a good example of interest group activity helped by a famous person. So here's Governor Walker, and I talked a little bit about labor unions. So Wisconsin in 2011 passed a law banning government employees from organizing, obviously hotly contested. And then in 2012, those groups tried to recall Governor Walker and did not succeed. Now understand, in Ohio, that same process was tried, but at the polls, we voted against it. Public interest groups, and that leads to number 25. What is a public interest group? And that is a group that works to gain benefits for society as a whole, works to gain benefits for society as a whole. So they advocate typically on ideology about issues concerning race, gender, sexual orientation, the environment, underpaid staff, often supported by donations and very little membership involvement. There's also government associations and nonprofit organizations in the public interest groups who can be very effective because they have large numbers as opposed to business, which has more money. Interest group formation and proliferation, the reason that we have so many is that the Constitution protects free speech, and that includes the right to lobby. And question number 28, how does pluralism enhance democracy? By ensuring that no single interest becomes dominant. And I'll cover that a little bit later. So under the First Amendment, number 22, since 1946, the Supreme Court of the United States has steadily favored what interest area? Business interest. And so what's happened, that corporations have been declared to have the same rights as people under the First Amendment, giving corporations the right to participate with lots of money in the political process. So that's been part of the court part. And the other is the Constitution provides a variety of access points because of checks and balances and separation of powers. People can write their local city person, they can write a county person, they can write a state legislature, they can write a federal legislature. So lots of places to get in, as opposed to a unitary system where you have one place basically to influence. The other is, and this again is question 29, interests take organizational forms, and they hire lobbyists typically, and then use Google, Facebook, and other public means. So why are there so many interest groups? Because we're a diverse society. That's why we have so many interest groups in America. The other is that it provides for a more active government. Today, government has far more regulation than it used to in the financial and other industries. Competition across the globe means that people are asking for government to help them. And I know I was reading that soybean farmers are having a record crop this year, but because of China's tariffs driving the price down, they're not doing as well. And so the response is, because the price went down, so the response is, what are we doing back? So that global economy affects it. So, and then there's government programs and initiatives, for example, supporting maybe new healthcare initiatives that would help rural communities. So those would be things that provide for more interest groups because we have a more active government. So here's one, lobbying for ethanol. I like this. So this is an interest group that understands that, using a variety of methods, but where would you rather buy your gas from? And this is supporting adding corn to gasoline. Disturbances. So groups form when interest are threatened. And the disturbance theory is, for example, women for a lot of years not paid the same wages as men, or young people feeling that their voice is not heard in government. So these are usually kind of harbors of changes in our economic and social environment. So those disturbances usually bring rise to groups. And here is one here, pro-life. Roe v. Wade was 1973. I was around during Roe v. Wade. So pro-life was the law of the land. And so once Roe v. Wade occurred, now we have very strong interest groups for pro-life and pro-choice, and lots of conflict between the two groups. So what do interest groups do? And they work both inside the system and outside the system. Obviously, people that don't want change, like business groups, they're going to work inside the system. And social and public groups that want change work outside the system. So the inside game is called the Good Old Boy Network, and it's really not about bribery. It's much more about persuasion. So they typically have access. They hire lobbyists, and those lobbyists are typically former congressmen or legislators is who they are. And note question 26, what is the primary mechanism for lobbyists to influence Congress? I know this for a fact. The primary mechanism is to provide technical information on policy issues, because that technical information is used by staff people that helps write the bills that congressmen introduce, right? The congressmen talk to people, they know the issues, but they need help on particularly the technical stuff, and lobbyists are more than happy to provide the right wording that helps them. So this is an example of Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York. He's shaking the hand of Attorney General Loretta Lynch, and they're heading off to the Senate Judiciary Committee, and that little group behind him are all his staff people. She's about to get, he's going to ask her some questions, and the staff have provided her the questions so she can be prepared. So that's all part of how that works. The other part is how do typically the game, you want to lobby to get bills you want passed. Now it's hard to get a bill passed, so 6% chance typically, but stop bills they do not like. That's easier. That's the 94%. Somebody puts a bill in, 94% of the time doesn't go anywhere. They also do financial contributions to people's campaign, help keep them running. Lobbying the executive branch, often providing technical information to people in bureaucracies. They tend to be former members of their industry. Maybe they worked in the executive branch, now they're in industry again. And then lobbying the courts. So they do lobby Congress, executive branch, and the courts. Question number 27, what is the role of amicus curiae brief? Amicus curiae, by the way, is Latin for friend of the court. So they're not a legal participant. They're not being sued or are suing, but they write briefs that provide influence. So if there's a particular case involving someone, a lobbyist might provide an amicus curiae brief to help the court in its decision. So that's the inside game. And here's two lobbyists shaking hands, kind of carving up territory. It's called game planning. I was part of that when I worked at Northern Kentucky University. We were lobbying the state legislature for higher ed reform, and I and another, the president and I would go to Frankfurt every day during a special session, and he would take one side of the aisle and I would take the other side, and we'd talk notes afterwards. He played more offense and I played more defense. It was pretty fun kind of doing that together. So here is Dick Heller, after the Supreme Court had passed that the gun law in D.C., D.C. passed a law that you couldn't have a handgun, and Dick Heller sued and got the right from the Second Amendment to have a handgun. The outside game is grassroots lobbying, and that is done typically by mobilizing members. So the outside game is all about membership lobbying government, organizing your people, shaping public opinion, and getting involved in a campaign for an issue or a campaign for an election. And typically these interest groups put report cards out. Here's Dianne Feinstein, Democrat from California, noted liberal, scoring 90 and 80 on typical issues that she's connected with. And then you have Jeff Sessions, Republican from Alabama, scoring 96 and 86, where Dianne scores 0 and 6. And then he scores 5 and 0 on her issues. So you know pretty well where you stand by these report cards. So interest groups create, in terms of corporate power and inequality, this is essay number 3. And so it asks about 3 areas. So I put them here: representational inequality, resource inequality, and access inequality. They lead to a very privileged position for business, corporate, and wealthy people in America. So under the many ways they do it, the first is that the groups are involved in all parts of the process. So that's the representational inequality. They have the power to get organized, they have resources, they have advocacy groups, and they're connected in many places. The resource inequality itself is that the Supreme Court has protected. If you look at Citizens United versus FEC and Speech Now versus FEC, these are the Supreme Court decisions that have helped businesses being declared as people and protected by free speech, and it lets them put uncontrollable amounts of money. Even though we've passed certain reforms of the financial industry, like the Dodd-Frank bill, there were many provisions of that bill that provided good loopholes for people not to be able to do things. So political action committees are called PACs, and they represent wealthy interests. And question number 30 is, what is a key differential of PACs organized to serve the poor and the underprivileged? Well, the reality is they're nearly absent in American politics. They're more prevalent in Europe. So these big political action committees are all about money and the influence of money. Poor and underprivileged, underserved people in our societies don't have PACs speaking for them, even amongst the public interest groups. Here is Jamie Dimon, JP Morgan Chase. His group bid on some risky derivative-based toxic loans. He lost his customers in 2012 $2 billion in one day in 2012, and then comes and says, I need help. And so you can see that that's like, what? Huh? Yeah, no. If I bet on the stock market wrong and I lost money, I just lost money. The government doesn't bail me out. So a lot of feeling here led to the Occupy Wall Street movement. So here's looking at spending on federal lobbying, healthcare, finance, communications, energy, transportation. These are all the big winners, and then the whole group of others like agribusiness, defense, construction, and labor kind of hitting behind. The access inequality is just access to decision makers, and it usually comes from hiring former regulatory staff. So it's called the Iron Issue Network, a looser, fluid network of people that move in and out. You work for the industry, and then maybe you become a staffer for a congressman, or you run for Congress and then you leave office and then you work as a lobbyist to go after your former constituents or your former legislators. So it really is a huge amount of access. So they have representational, they have equity and resource, and they have access, all in their advantage. So this is the Iron Triangle, number 24. What is an Iron Triangle? That's an alliance of common interest groups. The three interests here are an interest group, a congressional committee, and a bureaucratic agency. And that could be the Defense Department, defense contractors, and the Senate and House Armed Services Committee. They all work together. And typically the Department of Defense, 24 years, 30 years, you retire. Where do you work? You work for a defense contractor. Who do you lobby? The Senate, House, and Armed Services Committee that you use to be connected to. So that Iron Triangle was pointed out by Eisenhower when he left the presidency as a military general. He said, watch out for that Iron Triangle. But it's there, and it is effective. It is very effective. So the privileged position of corporation, does it undermine democracy? Well, they have privilege, but it doesn't necessarily undermine. They have more lobbyists, more access, but there's lots of things that kind of counter that. Business, here's the quote, the business of America is business. We have a president right now who's a businessman. So if business falls, we all fall. These are the arguments that we give. So on the one hand, we say privilege. On the other hand, we all benefit from it. The Republican conservative argument is if all these boats are doing well, everybody does well. And then the Democratic argument is, yeah, that's true, but rich people are getting richer and we need to redistribute that. These people, the rich people, need to be managed by government a little bit. The other is that globalization has led to mobility, but business, by the way, doesn't always get its way. Environmental health and safety regulations clearly get into the way of business to the good. What I would say is typically big business can kind of fend them off. Small and medium business can't. So we do regulations, and then small and medium businesses wind up struggling. And that's the place where the economy needs to grow, is small and medium business. So, but they are very strong when they're together as a political coalition, unbeatable as a matter of fact. Here's the average tax rate for the wealthiest Americans. So the Democrats would look at this and say, oh my gosh, that tax rate has gone down, down, down since Kennedy. Well, the reality is I look at, Johnson, Democrat, Nixon, a Republican, Ford a Republican, Carter a Democrat, Reagan Republican, Bush Republican, Clinton a Democrat, Bush Republican, Obama a Democrat. Oh, so it's gone down under both Democrats and Republicans. So no matter how you cut it, the tax rate for the wealthiest Americans has gone down regardless of who's in office, regardless of who the Congress is. It isn't a Republican or Democrat issue. So curing the mischievousness of the groups would be, having more public disclosure. There are over 11,000 lobbyists in Washington, D.C. alone. There's over 260,000 people in the lobby industry that are mostly in Washington and a couple of other cities. The other is the revolving door of people moving from the bureaucracy over to the contractors and interest groups, and then occasionally into the staff people of the Congress, and then back again. And even though there have been two McCain-Feingold bills in 2003 and 2007 to regulate it with lots of follow-ups, it still is still a difficulty for our society. I think we feel overall, most political scientists say the benefits outweigh the curse, that we have a democratic society with lots of help. And because of that, it's the price you pay that the people that have most access get their way a little bit more. But there's plenty of room for the average citizen to get involved. That is not true in most of the other governments around the planet. I'll talk about this in class, the interactive exercise of Ohio PIRG. That's a public interest group right here in Ohio. Taking a snip, I believe, at all of the study guide points. Notice the three advantages that I covered for the essay. So this concludes a video lecture, and then on October 2, we'll spend the entire time on the study guides for chapters 5 through 7 and essays 1 through 3, so please be prepared. And then October 4, we'll do social movements. And then October 9 is work on writing assignment number 2. That'll be a digital day. I will be with the other presidents down in Columbus that day. And so that's our schedule as well. And I hope you enjoyed this video